Welcome to Module Psych 2025, Cognitive Neuroscience, in this spring semester 2021. My name is Tobias Feldmann-Wüstefeld and I'm a lecturer in Cognitive Neuroscience and Psychology here at the University of Southampton. Today will be the first session, the introductory session, where we will talk about some philosophical considerations in cognitive neuroscience, the history of cognitive neuroscience, and then also the relationship between psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And then last but not least, we will go into the details about the neural activity, based on which several methods we will talk about in the coming sessions are based upon. If you haven't done so already, please watch the video excerpt from the movie The Matrix now before we continue. So what did we see in the video The Matrix? Here, the reality as perceived by humans is actually some kind of simulation, a simulated reality called The Matrix. And one of the key sentences maybe is, what is real? What you feel, smell, taste and see? Then real is simply an electrical signal interpreted by our brain. So this refers to the experience we make in our everyday life. All the input to our brain needs to be interpreted by our brain, but in principle could be simulated. Any electrical signal that goes into our brain could be simulated by a computer, by simulation, and we would not know the difference. Any changes in behavior and cognition, for example, the ability to fly in the last scene of this video, is something that is related to changes in the brain. We cannot learn, we cannot change our behavior without changes in the brain occurring. So, in sum, we can say that all human behavior and experience is based on neural activity. And that's why cognitive neuroscience is important for us as psychologists, because we as psychologists try to understand human behavior and cognition. The idea of being in a simulated reality that we misperceive is actually much older than the movie The Matrix. It goes back to philosophical considerations by René Descartes, a French philosopher and mathematician who had the idea that an evil demon is actually deceiving our senses. So instead of the hell we live in, we might actually perceive our environment as, well, for example, a lecture room, a full lecture room that you at this point might not have seen in a while, given the pandemic. And this philosophical idea was then revived when computer metaphors became more common. For example, in the brain in a jar thought experiment by Gilbert Harman. Here the idea is that the brain is removed from our body and sustained in a life-sustaining liquid. And there's neurons connected by wires to a supercomputer. So you can see this here. The brain gets some input from the supercomputer, and then the computer sends an electrical signal maybe back to the brain, which is then what the brain receives our perception. The computer receives output from our brain, which could be something like motor functions. Imagine you decide to move your leg, and then this impulse will be transferred to the computer. Now, the critical point about the thought experiment is that no brain can tell whether it is embodied in a jar or not. If the simulation, if the input and output is well enough simulated by the computer, then none of us could actually tell whether we are in such a simulation if we get input from such a computer, or we are actually, if our brain is actually in our body. And the thought that we are in Class Psych 2025 might just be an illusion. So this direct connection between the brain and thoughts and cognition might be very obvious to us right now, but if you look at the media, they sometimes seem to be surprised by the connection of mind and brain, as these examples here show. So, for example, pain, is it all in your head? Well, of course it is all in your head. Where else would it be? Without our brain interpreting impulses from pain receptors, we would not have pain. And obviously, this can also be something where a malfunction happens, and even if we don't get input from our external senses, we might perceive pain, which is, for example, the case if you have phantom pain. Okay, let's have a look at the philosophical approaches that were taken to address this mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem is related to this possibility of a simulation, namely the idea that our brain might actually just perceiving our reality as we experience it. But how is this connected? So how is the real world connected to our mind, to our consciousness? How can physical substance give rise, the physical substance being the brain and the input from our senses? How can that give rise to sensations, thoughts, and emotions? So there were three approaches in philosophy to consider this. In dualism, which was something Descartes argued in favor of, soul and body are different and independent substances. So this might also have a religious connotation, but in principle what he said is that the soul is entirely different from the body, but they are obviously somewhere connected, because we as a person we do feel having a consciousness. So he quite unscientifically had the idea that there's some kind of interaction going on between these two substances, soul and body, in the pineal gland. The pineal gland was kind of special in a way, or is special in a way, that it is one of the few areas of the brain that are not lateralized. So there's only one central part of the pineal gland. So maybe that was special enough for him to give him to assign this critical role to the pineal gland. But obviously this is not based on science. This is more speculation and philosophy. The dual aspect theory was then brought forward by Spinoza in 1677. Here, mind and brain are two different levels of explanation for the same thing. So an analogy would be that a photon can be a particle and a wave, or it is both at the same time, but depending on how we consider it, it can be either one. And that is the same with, for example, with cognition, for example. So when we love somebody, for example, this might be just chemical reactions in the brain, but it's also still a real emotion and something we do perceive as real, and this is just the flip side of the coin of those chemical reactions going on in the brain. In reductionism, a later consideration philosophy that came up with in the 20th century, here the reasoning is that all mind-based concepts such as emotion, memory, attention, and so on are currently useful to describe how the human mind works, but they can and probably will at some point be replaced by biological or maybe even physical constructs once we know enough. So emotions, it is useful to talk about them, but only because we don't know enough about the biology and the underlying neural mechanisms. So quite a radical view, but maybe not so unrealistic, given that with modern computing mechanisms, fast computing, we can actually calculate brain activity very precisely already. So we've talked about these philosophical approaches, but what is there actually of like what kind of actual evidence do we have that body and mind are connected. One of the first demonstrations of such a connection comes from the Montreal Procedure, which was performed by Penfield and Jasper in 1954. So Penfield was a Canadian neurosurgeon, and he treated patients with severe epilepsy. So his aim was to destroy those nerve cells at the seizure origin, so that the patients wouldn't have seizures anymore. And they had roughly an idea of where in the brain they were originating, but they wanted to make that very accurate by targeting the responsible areas and stimulate the brain with an electrical probe while patients were conscious. The idea being the patients could report what they feel and what they sense, what they perceive, so that those areas most critical for life quality could be spared if possible. And they observed an interesting phenomenon, namely, the stimulation of certain brain areas can indeed lead to, for example, a vivid recall of memories, or to olfactory, so smell, visual and auditory hallucinations. So maybe that's not too much of a surprise right now, because we nowadays have a pretty good idea of how sensations and the brain are mapped. But back then this was quite a revolutionary finding, that there's such a direct connection between stimulating certain brain areas and then participants, or in this case patients, actually perceiving the associated feeling, or even having a recall of memories which may be stored in those areas. Another example that demonstrates how body and mind are directly connected is TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you apply a magnetic field to the cortex. So here you can see the coil, and this is the magnetic field. The stroked red lines are the magnetic field, and you can see that it does interact with the brain due to the induced magnetic field. This is a non-invasive method, and you will learn more about this method in a separate session where we're talking about neuroscience methods such as TMS separately. But for now, what is important to know is that, for example, if you apply this TMS coil over the occipital lobe, so the back here, then what participants often report are phosphines, so light dots, even though there's no actual light, of course. And then if you stimulate the motor cortex, you can see something like this. So here this participant does not voluntarily move their hand or arm, but rather because of the stimulation of the motor cortex. And you can measure that with an electromyogram. All right, so to summarize, psychology wants to explain behavior and the experience of humans. And because all human behavior and experience is the result of brain processes, as we've seen, for example, on a more philosophical level in the Matrix, or the brain in the jar thought experiment, but also in real applications like TMS or this brain surgery. And by understanding the brain processes, we can thus also better understand psychological processes. This is why neuroscience is important for psychology. Let's have a look at the word cognitive neuroscience, since we're talking about cognitive neuroscience for the rest of this semester. So the word cognoscere is Latin for to experience or to recognize. So this refers to mental processes of transforming information. Then we have neuron, which is Greek for string or nerve. So this refers to our nervous system. And then, of course, science comes from the Latin word scientia for knowledge. So we have the knowledge about structures, functions, and mechanisms of the nervous system, and we want to use that to describe or explain mental processes. So I've used the word cognition quite a lot, and I just want to give you a few examples of what cognitive functions are. So for example, this can be social cognition related to the interaction with other humans, executive functions, making a decision, attention, limiting the input to the visual system, for example, emotion as a cognitive function, and so on. So for the remainder of this module, we will talk about some of these cognitive functions in more detail, and you will learn how cognitive neuroscience is related to these. For example, how cognitive neuroscience methods can be used to measure these functions. So for now, let's conclude. So much about philosophical considerations, and the next part we will talk about the history of cognitive neuroscience.